Hello everyone, my name's Adam. And in this problem, we're going to be practicing factoring trigonometric expressions and then using our fundamental trig identities to simplify them if we can. So what we're going to start with is the expression 1 minus 2 cosine squared x plus cosine to the fourth x. Now if this is new to you, it's going to look a little strange because we're not used to seeing cosine squares and cosines to the fourth all put into one big expression. But fundamentally, this is no different than what we've done before in algebra. For example, we have 1 minus 2 times a quantity squared plus the same quantity to the fourth. So that's really the same thing as having something like, say, 1 minus 2y squared plus y to the fourth. And as we said, the first thing that we want to do is just factor this. So really we can kind of ignore the cosine part and just think about what we have as something like this. Okay? So in factoring things like this, which we've done before in algebra, I think the easiest thing to do is first rewrite it in descending power order. So we take something like our 1 minus 2y squared plus y to the fourth and write it as y to the fourth minus 2y squared plus 1. So we'll go over and do the same thing with our trigonometric expression. And write that as cosine to the fourth x minus 2 cosine squared x plus 1. Now, before we get into factoring, since this is our first take in this, let's go ahead and look at this expression over here. So, when we go to factor something like this, how do we first think of it? Well, we have a y to the fourth and a y squared. So we've seen problems like this before, where really we can think of this as kind of a quadratic in disguise. Namely, my y to the fourth I can think of as y squared squared minus 2y squared plus 1. Now, essentially, I have a quadratic in the term y squared. And we go to factor that. What terms multiply together to give us y to the fourth? Well, our first terms are going to be y squared and y squared. And for the ending terms, we look at the factors of positive 1 that add together to give us negative 2. And namely, we get negative 1 and minus 1. Coming back to our trigonometric expression, it's exactly the same steps. So I'm going to think of this just like we did over here as y squared squared minus 2y squared plus 1. I have cosine squared squared minus 2 cosine squared x plus 1. And we go to factor this. What factors are going to multiply together to give us cosine to the fourth? Well, cosine squared x and cosine squared x. And same thing, what factors multiply together to give us positive 1 and add to negative 2? Minus 1 and minus 1. So we factored our trigonometric expression. And now, noticing that we have cosine squared minus 1 and cosine squared minus 1, we can clean this up a little bit and write it as cosine squared minus 1 quantity squared. So the first part is done. We're done factoring it. Then we said we wanted to simplify using fundamental trig identities if possible. So we take a look at this. Cosine squared minus 1. What trig identities have anything to do with this? Personally, whenever I see a cosine squared and a 1 involved, I think of my Pythagorean identities. Namely, we have the identity, say, sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1. And how can this help us? Well, if we notice, looking at my cosine squared minus 1, to get those two terms together, if I first start by subtracting cosine squared, I get a sine squared x equals 1 minus cosine squared x. Close, but not quite there. I have 1 minus cosine squared x and cosine squared x minus 1. Well, if you remember from algebra, whenever you have subtraction of two terms, you can reverse the subtraction by multiplying through with a negative. So that's what we're going to do. multiply through both sides by -1. Our negative here would get us negative sine squared x. Distributing with our negative, we have -1 plus cosine squared x. And just reversing the order, we can write this as cosine squared x minus 1. So cosine squared x minus 1 is equal to negative sine squared x. So that is what we can use to simplify. So here we go. So substituting for cosine squared x minus 1, we have negative sine squared x, which is being squared. So we just square this. Squaring a negative makes it positive, and squaring sine squared gives us sine to the 4th x. So there we have it. We've factored the trigonometric expression and simplified as far as we can go using fundamental trig identities. Thank you very much.